For nearly half a century, the nation of Albania remained an enigma, locked behind the ironclad isolationism of its leader, Castriot. The landscape was defined by an architectural obsession with defense. Hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers stood like gray mushrooms across the mountains and beaches. Castriot's regime was built on a foundation of self-reliance and the pervasive shadow of the Sigurimi, the secret police. Every citizen lived under the watchful eye of a state that prioritized ideological purity over economic reality, creating a society frozen in a bygone era of Stalinist dogma. By the early 1990s, the silence of the populace began to break. Ilira, a young student at the University of Tirana, became the voice of a generation that had grown weary of hunger and censorship. She led clandestine meetings where forbidden Western literature and radio broadcasts were shared. Ilira understood that the regime's power relied on fear, and that fear could only be dismantled through collective defiance. In the dimly lit corridors of the dormitories, she organized the first student strikes, demanding pluralism and the right to see the world beyond the borders. The movement found an unlikely ally in Dritan, a senior clerk within the Ministry of Interior's archives. For years, Dritan had watched as the state's financial stability crumbled, hidden behind fabricated statistics. He met Ilira in the secluded corner of a city park, handing over leather-bound ledgers that proved the regime was bankrupt. This exchange of information was the bridge between student passion and administrative reality. With Dritan's evidence, the protesters could prove that the perfect state was nothing more than a hollow shell. As the protests intensified, Castriot retreated further into his private bunker, a labyrinthine complex designed to withstand a nuclear strike. He refused to acknowledge the thousands of people gathered in Skanderbeg Square. To him, the dissent was not a call for reform, but a foreign-funded sabotage. He signed orders for the military to prepare for internal pacification, unaware that the soldiers, sons of the very workers who were protesting, were already questioning their loyalty to a ghost. The collapse reached its zenith when the massive bronze statue of the former dictator was pulled down in the heart of the capital. Ilira was at the front of the surge, watching as the symbol of decades of oppression hit the pavement with a deafening roar. The Sigurimi stood by, paralyzed by the sheer volume of the crowd. It was a moment of catharsis. The psychological barrier of the regime had been breached. Ilira climbed atop the fallen bronze head, not out of malice, but to signal that the era of the individual had finally begun. In a final, desperate attempt to maintain order, Castriot summoned the leadership of the new opposition to his office. Dritan accompanied the delegation, presenting the evidence of the state's total insolvency. The confrontation was not violent, but clinical. Dritan laid out the charts and the empty treasury reports, showing Castriot that there was nothing left to govern. The transition of power was signed on a simple piece of stationery, ending the longest-running communist regime in Europe without a shot being fired in the palace. The aftermath was not the immediate utopia many had hoped for. The productive chaos of the mid-90s saw the rise of pyramid schemes that promised wealth but delivered ruin. Dritan, now working for the Transitional Central Bank, watched in horror as the nation's newfound savings evaporated in a matter of months. He walked through the port of Duray, seeing thousands of his countrymen boarding ships to Italy, fleeing the economic collapse. The euphoria of the revolution was replaced by the cold reality of building a market from scratch. During the period of civil unrest that followed the financial crash, Ilira worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile democratic institutions. She stood at the podium of the new People's Assembly, pleading for calm and the rule of law. She argued that the failures of the present should not lead back to the autocracy of the past. Her role had shifted from a revolutionary firebrand to a steady hand of governance, navigating the treacherous waters of a nation that was learning the true cost of freedom. By the dawn of the new millennium, a degree of stability returned. Ilira and Dritan collaborated on the final draft of the National Constitution, a document that guaranteed the separation of powers and the protection of civil liberties. They met in the newly renovated National Library, signing the document that would anchor Albania to the rest of Europe. It was a culmination of a decade of struggle, marking the official end of the transition from a closed society to an open republic. Today, the bunkers that once symbolized fear have been repurposed as cafes, art galleries, and museums. Driton, now a historian, documents the era for future generations, ensuring the lessons of the transition are never forgotten. He knows that the Eagle's Land is still a work in progress, but the silence of the past has been replaced by the vibrant, often loud, discourse of a living democracy. The journey from isolation to integration continues, etched into the very stones of the mountains.